Thanks so much for joining me today on this brand new webinar we've been just kicking off recently. We're going to talk today about workplace bullies and abrasive leaders, why they act that way, and how to stop them. This is very exciting for me. So to increase your viewing pleasure today, I recommend that you turn off everything in your background, including your email, chats, phones, all that good stuff. Silence your phones, close your door. Give yourself some time to discover new strategies and new things about this very elusive group of people that we call workplace bullies. I'm going to go pretty quick today. There's a lot of information, so get out that pad and pen. And stay tuned. I'm going to offer up something at the end of the webinar, so just wanted to let you know that. If you have any questions along the way, I love to be interactive. This is not one of those boring webinars where you're going to sit there quietly while I talk. I would love to hear comments, questions, things that you have to say along the way. So get familiar with that questions tab in the dashboard there for your GoToWebinar. And I'll be sure to stay tuned on that as well as I'm going along so that I can address questions and comments along the way. So I have a question for you. Is your boss a psychopath? Do you work with an animal at work? Are you with a brutal boss in their prey or a snake in suit? What about an asshole? How many of us work with an asshole? Hey, my assistant's messing with me. She put yes. That's awesome. All right, so you are in the right place if you know there is a problem with aggressive bullying or abrasive behavior and you want to put a stop to it. Now, the reality is that this person is pretty frustrating, but they're also probably seen as very valuable by somebody in the organization or they wouldn't be there anymore. And the problem also is that everyone's running away from solving this problem instead of addressing it. And so I'm curious to hear from you all, what is your reality? So that's the reality I see all the time, that this person is seen as very valuable and thus the C-suite hesitates to address the behavior. So curious to hear from you. And of course, you don't have to give me all the dirty details, but what's your reality? Or in other words, why are you on the webinar today? What's happening in your world? I do see a question about HRCI and SHRM credits. I did not have time to get this webinar approved for that, but I know that you can always tell them that you've been in activities that didn't necessarily have a number assigned to them and still use the content for your credits. All right, so I'm hearing about power imbalance. That's one person's reality. What are some other people's realities? C-suite walks all over the manager, and so the manager doesn't get fired and subordinates leave, okay? Civility is getting lost. Definitely hearing some of that, both in the workplace and on the news, huh? Two cases, one high in management, one is a team leader that subestimates people. Okay, so you've got two abrasive leaders, as we'll call them today. Oh, they're all coming in pretty quickly. Behavior is not addressed. When I say something, they just tell me I'm being sensitive. Yes, I hear that a lot. This bully is very politically savvy and covering their tracks. The executive is always abrasive and attacking others verbally, being in HR and having a bullying environment. Okay, and yeah, I definitely hear, well, that's just how he or she is. Why are you being so sensitive? So I am familiar with all of these comments. Harassment and bullying happenings. So we're at a family-owned business. Yep, so small business, it's going to be particularly difficult. Someone was bullied by a director. Women are hard on women, indeed. All right, so people not being held accountable. Okay, so yep, there's a lot of realities out there, and I think my webinar today will really touch on a lot of these issues and how you can go about resolving them. So before I jump in too far, if you don't know who I am, just wanted to share a little bit about me and my story and how I got here. I am a subject matter expert on the topic of workplace bullying, and I've been publishing and researching and writing and speaking and consulting and training on that topic for quite a while. So my story is that I was the director of human resources for an organization where we had a workplace bully, and this person's behavior was pretty difficult. He made life hard, and I personally felt bullied by this guy. And then as the director of HR, I experienced all of the problems that he created for the organization. For example, lots of turnover in his department. I spent a lot of time counseling people who were dealing with him. And I also personally got a lot of counseling from another manager down the hall. So a lot of wasted time and money. And just as you all mentioned, every time I spoke to the president about it, he would just say, well, that's how he is. I don't know why it bothers you. You have to be the bigger person. You're being sensitive, you know, despite all the evidence that it was everyone that was feeling these things about this individual. And so during that time, I started getting my master's degree and ended up having a class called The Dark Side of Communication. And this class was about all things dark in human interaction. And of course, I had to write a paper on something dark in human interactions. And so I decided to write a paper on my situation at work. And it was during that paper that I came across the phrase workplace bullying, and I have been literally obsessed with the topic of workplace bullying ever since that paper, and that was long ago. And so I was happy to discover that there was 30 years of academic research on this topic. You know, not happy that it's happening, but happy to know that I wasn't crazy. And I found writing that paper very therapeutic. And since then, I've really just made it my mission to help organizations solve this problem. Over time, I've had the fortunate experience of publishing in a huge array of magazines and national venues. I'm a regular contributor on Forbes, and I've also had a huge array of clients ranging from colleges to the military to Chevron, large tech companies, a company that makes jets, all kinds of cool stuff. So I've had a lot of experience consulting with these companies, training, and then ultimately I've more recently become certified in a process called boss whispering, which is one of the things we'll cover a little later. I'll tell you all about boss whispering, but I have really enjoyed coaching these individuals that we call workplace bullies, and hence the webinar. Wanted to share it all with you. So I want to make something clear before I get too much farther. Abrasive leaders and workplace bullies can change. They are people, after all. So one issue I run up against a lot is people say, well, they'll never change. They're psychopaths. That's the way they are. There's nothing you can do about it. They enjoy making people's lives miserable. And honestly, that is just not the case. They absolutely can change. Absolutely, absolutely. And so I want you to imprint this in your mind as you're listening and understand that they can change and all hope is not lost. They absolutely can change. So this webinar right now, I am going to tell you how to stop this behavior. So stay with me and I'll give you all kinds of good information. So we are going to cover what workplace bullying entails. We'll kind of define it. We'll talk about this new lens that I want to share with you for looking at bullying. I'll give you 3 steps to intervening, and then we'll talk a lot about boss whispering, this coaching method and how it works. So who are abrasive leaders? They're any individual charged with managerial authority whose interpersonal behavior causes emotional distress in coworkers sufficient to disrupt organizational functioning, otherwise known as workplace bullies. So these are individuals whose behavior is so disruptive to the organization that people are not talking to each other, they're not communicating, they're not offering the best customer service, they're doing a lot of going around this person in order to avoid interacting with them. So what I'll say here on this slide is we like the phrase workplace bullies and bullying. I'm going to switch to using the term abrasive leaders because I hate to name call as I'm talking about these individuals. And, I want to be sensitive to calling people's names. So abrasive leaders are workplace bullies. They're one and the same, but I'm going to use the phrase abrasive leaders. I see a question. Are we going to have access to the slides? I haven't decided yet. You might be able to convince me, but we will definitely send out the recording a little later today. All right, so bullying defined. Let's talk through it. So there's a ton of definitions out there on the topic of workplace bullying, and they all come down to these 4 things. The first thing is that bullying is repeated. So we're not talking about a one-time situation. Someone got angry, they yelled, and then we all got over it and moved on. That's not workplace bullying. Bullying is repeated, ongoing, pervasive. Researchers who have to quantify things to study them, they'll say that bullying happens about once a week for a period of 6 months for us to sort of officially say, yes, it's bullying. Next up, bullying creates a psychological power imbalance. So bullying is not conflict. It is about a psychological power imbalance. So the way bullying happens is you have an individual who lashes out in some way. They engage in some sort of abrasive behavior. They yell, they make a nasty comment, they send off a snarky email, they do something that's unprofessional and abrasive, and nobody says anything about it. And they don't say anything because maybe they're afraid to, maybe they're not sure what happened, they're sort of confused by it, maybe they sort of brush it off as, it was just a one time, but for whatever reason, nobody says anything in that initial incident. And so this individual, the abrasive leader, gets a sort of subconscious green light that they can continue to act that way. So then they do it again, and then again, and then again, and then again. And over time, this behavior gets worse and worse, and it gets more and more aggressive and more frequent. And eventually, this power imbalance shows up where the individual recognizes that they have power over everybody else, and everybody else recognizes that this person has power over them. So there's this real psychological warfare going on here where people are literally afraid of this individual. Bullying causes harm. So all of this stuff is certainly causing harm to the people at the receiving end as well as witnesses. So people who self-identify as being bullied or targets, they experience anxiety, stress, depression, and of course all of that psychological and emotional stuff happening causes physical damage. Lots of research on heart disease being a problem from bullying, lots of research that post-traumatic stress disorder can actually occur as a result of being bullied. There are unfortunately stories of suicide, people thinking about suicide. So it really and truly is abuse, absolutely. And then witnesses are also experiencing this. So although somebody may not necessarily self-identify, and I saw someone's their comment earlier that they don't feel bullied, but others are. So that makes you a witness, and you're also psychologically sort of damaged by this. You also feel stressed out. You also feel unhappy. You're also wondering where management is and why aren't they stepping in. So witnesses are also experiencing damage and of course are afraid that they'll be next. Finally, bullying is expensive. This costs a whole lot of money and time and resources for the organization. So people aren't producing, they're spending a lot of time talking about what's happening, they are looking for other jobs while they're clocked in and working, so the organization is losing out. There's of course a lot of turnover. Would you consider managers who psychologically manipulate people are abrasive? Yes, I would. To answer your question. So abrasive leaders is just the nice term for anybody who's engaging in workplace bullying. So it sounds like that person is engaging in workplace bullying. And so we use the term abrasive leader to give them a name rather than workplace bully. But yes, they count. All right, so let's talk about bullying behaviors. Actually, any other questions? before I move forward, since we had that one? Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'll keep going. If you have one, by all means, let me know. Okay, so let's talk about bullying behaviors. So there are a ton of laundry lists out there in the world on the topic of bullying, and people just sort of list these bullet points of things that count as bullying behaviors. I noticed a pattern in all of those lists, as well as in the surveys that researchers use to study workplace bullying. And discovered that there are these sort of buckets, 3 buckets of behaviors. I see someone's asking me to flip back. I'm happy to do that. I'm sure you are frantically writing. Repeated, creates psychological power imbalance, causes harm to targets and witnesses, and it's expensive. Okay, all right, let's go. So there are 3 buckets of bullying behaviors. The first bucket is aggressive communication, things that we can see, yelling, getting in someone's personal space, harsh body language, like harsh finger pointing, or having an aggressive sort of stance, sending off emails that are mean and aggressive. This bucket is all about the stuff that we can see. Sending, evil text messages at midnight. One example of this, one individual that I coached, one of his aggressive overt communication behaviors was during staff meetings. He would actually stand up in the staff meeting and sort of lean over the table. And he never yelled in these staff meetings, but it was all very, rude, harsh tone sort of communication. And when I was interviewing people as I was getting into the coaching, people said that when he did that, it was like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. He'd sort of rise up out of his chair and his chest would puff up, and you could see the sort of anger and frustration overcoming him, and his facial expressions changed and his eyes started bulging. And so there was this real domination that was coming out in all of his body language. That would be an example of aggressive communication. The next bucket of bullying behaviors is humiliation. So doing things like socially isolating someone, pointing out mistakes in public, sending off emails about mistakes and CCing other people in the office, not inviting someone to events that everyone else is invited to, leaving people off of projects that should be on the projects, hazing people, playing practical jokes that are mean and unfair. So doing things that leave this person feeling humiliated and embarrassed. The last bucket of bullying behaviors is manipulation. So this is what makes bullying complicated, because this is stuff that you can't really see or pinpoint or point to and say, aha, that's bullying. So this is all the passive aggressive stuff that bullies engage in. So I'm sorry, abrasive leaders engage in. So manipulation includes things like giving someone only a few of the instructions when there's many more instructions, so that the person can't perform well because they're missing information. Giving someone poor performance scores and marks when really they're a good performer. Manipulation of work, so giving so much work that people can't possibly do it, or taking key responsibilities away, leaving somebody feeling sort of lost and confused. Punitive punishment, you were 2 minutes late and I'm writing you up and yelling at you, these kinds of things. So just to give you some other examples of manipulation, one woman that I worked with, she asked me to help her write a letter to the EEOC. One thing that was happening with her is people in her office all had around 30 case files, but she had 60 case files, and then she'd have 80 case files, and then she'd have 4 case files, and her manager was really messing with her workflow. Everybody else had a steady slew of cases. And so she, of course, was failing. And she actually was very transparent about that, and had talked to her manager about it. And the manager would just say, well, you've been here the longest. I know you can handle it. But then performance evaluation time came around and it says you're a poor performer, you're not keeping up with the demands of your workload, and you're being demoted. So that's an example of manipulation. The work was really manipulated and she was sort of set up to fail. Um, Actually, I wanted to give one other example I meant to give when I was talking about humiliation. That same individual who would stand up in staff meetings and lean over the table and kind of use this aggressive communication. One other thing he would do in those staff meetings is lean back in his chair and put his feet up on the table. And then he'd launch into dissertations about why people's ideas were stupid and why they wouldn't work. So that is both aggressive communication, even though it's leaning back in the chair with your feet on the table. That's a power stance. And then he would go on and lecture somebody about their stupid idea in front of others in the staff meeting. So that's another good example. All right, I see a question. Anytime I try to address my manager about a bullying manager, I get told they were kidding. I'm a process engineer and I implement change daily, and folks that have been doing the same job for over 20 years get very aggressive. How long do I have to hear they were kidding or don't be sensitive? You know what? I think that you need to take it to the next level. I think that your manager is brushing something off that's much more serious, and that would be my short answer. But we can certainly talk more about it offline. But it sounds like you need to go to the next level. Okay, so let's talk about the damage that this causes. So, I talked about it a bit, but wanted to give you my handy dandy arrows here. So when there is workplace bullying in an organization, anxiety goes up, detachment from work and clients, discouragement, absenteeism, turnover, all of this bad stuff is going up, and all of this other good stuff is going down. People don't, they're not performing, they're disengaged, their job satisfaction goes down, their learning and innovation goes down, their relationships aren't working very well, communication's not working well. So this is a very expensive process. And so those of you online that are in HR and need a sort of business case to address the workplace bullying, you can talk about this sorts of damage that's happening here. So one other thing I want to point out, especially with all of this focus on harassment lately, is that bullying and harassment actually aren't all that different. And so when you're thinking of making a business case to the CEO about this behavior, I recommend that you talk about how close the lines are blurred here with harassment and bullying. So this is the definition of harassment that I took from the EEOC's website. And all I did was remove the part about the protected class. And so when you do that, you can see that we are actually describing workplace bullying. So bullying and harassment are the exact same thing. The behaviors are exactly the same. The difference is that we add this whole thing about protected classes and then we call it harassment. But they are the same. On the flip side, violence and workplace bullying are the same. And I would say workplace bullying is a form of violence and harassment is a form of bullying. Violence is about verbal abuse, and the legal definition of assault is that the person on the receiving end was afraid of being assaulted. You don't actually have to harm somebody or punch them in the face for it to count as assault. So violence and bullying really are blurred as well. So just to give you an example of that, a couple of examples actually. One individual that I coached, one of the things that he did was, or what caused the employer to reach out for a coach was that this individual had been yelling for years. He'd always yelled and people would just, that's how he is. He yelled so egregiously at someone one day that this individual had a literal panic attack and literally said that his tongue was swelling up and that if this abrasive leader had sort of come at him physically, he would not have been able to move. He felt like his feet were planted to the ground and he had a literal physical panic attack. And so when we think about that, I think we can all agree, well, gosh, that sounds like workplace violence. How, he was so afraid. But all those other years that he'd been yelling, just because nobody had a panic attack, it doesn't mean it wasn't violence. In another example of how easily this can cross over, actually the first time that workplace bullying ever appeared in a court case was in Indiana. And what happened was a surgeon had been really bullying this other individual who works in the operating room for a while. And one day the surgeon let his emotions and frustration get the best of him, and he raised his fist to punch this other individual. He didn't actually punch. His fist raised and then he put it down. And that is assault, even though he didn't actually touch him. So violence and bullying are too close for comfort in my mind, in my book. Okay, so let's talk about workplace bullies or abrasive leaders and why they act that way. So the common assumptions of these individuals is that they're fully aware of their behavior. They know it makes people, feel bad about themselves. And in fact, a lot of people think that's the intention, that these people are, focused on harming those around them, and that they cannot change. These are the common assumptions. The reality is that they are fully unaware of their behavior, and their intention really and truly is to get the job done, and really and truly they are coachable. So I want to take you through this piece here and kind of talk with you about why I know they are fully unaware and why their intention is to get the job done. I do see a question. I'm going to take a sip of water here. Okay, my board member whispered that he was going to sue me, and when I responded that I take that personal, he leaned into my ear and whispered harshly, you bet your sweet ass that's a threat. And he was mad. He was so mad he was spitting. That is workplace violence. That's an example, a perfect example. That's violence. You can't make threats like that. That absolutely counts. So thanks for sharing that example. Unfortunately, that person's unaware of how his or her behavior, how his behavior affected you, and probably felt that it was appropriate in the moment without realizing the real damage that was being done there. So, just to kind of speak to all of us, those of you on the webinar who are thinking of that time you were bullied, maybe in a previous job, or who are bullied now, I know it's hard to hear it when I say this behavior is not intentional, because I know it feels intentional. I've been there. I absolutely understand. But I implore you to open your mind a little bit to what I'm saying here, that they really are fully unaware. If they intended to hurt you, that would make them a psychopath. And we just know that not that many people are walking around among us as psychopaths. So it's not intentional. They honestly feel that their behavior is appropriate, and I'll talk to you about why they think it's appropriate here in a moment. But just to give you some examples of this full unawareness. So Joe is an individual that I coached, and when I met with Joe, I asked him about coaching and how was he feeling and was he ready to, engage. And what he said to me was, I've been walking around like this for 3 years and nobody told me. I wish they'd told me sooner. What's interesting about this statement is he had been told many times that his behavior was out of control. People had transferred out of his department to get away from him. His manager had had many sort of conflict management meetings with him and others. So there was a whole lot of evidence that he had been told over and over and over again. The thing is that people like Joe are lacking insight. He did not understand when his manager was saying your behavior is inappropriate. He was lacking insight. Art is another individual that I coached, and when I met with him initially to talk to him about coaching, he said to me, I'm just managing the way that I'm managed. You should see what happens in the C-suite meetings I attend. And honestly, he spent the beginning of our coaching, a lot of our conversation turned to why do I have to do this? Why aren't you coaching all of these other people? They act just like me. And the answer was that he had done something pretty egregious that caused the focus to turn on him. But he was just acting in the way that he saw and witnessed, and he was in the C-suite, and so he would go to these C-suite meetings, and he wasn't doing anything different. And so in his mind, it was kind of like, I don't understand. Okay, so the other thing here is that their intention really and truly is to get the job done. So here's why their behavior is not intentional, okay? Bullies have a strong desire to be seen as uber competent. That drives everything. And they live in fear of being seen as incompetent. And so anything that threatens that competence causes them to be a bully or to lash out and engage in this behavior. So they believe that their behavior is okay because they think it's focused on their ability to appear competent. And whatever reason, if you are being bullied, you are threatening this person's competence in some way, and that is why you are being bullied. So it's not coming from a place of, I want to make everyone's life miserable. It's coming from a place of, this person is affecting my competence or my ability to appear competent, and so I'm coming after you. So just to kind of look at this another way, what's happening is these individuals perceive a threat to their competence. That makes them feel anxious, and then they're defending. So you might remember fight or flight. You probably learned about fight or flight in science class at some point in your younger years, and that's what's happening. They perceive this threat to competence. It causes them to feel anxiety, and they defend. So the other piece of this is that they also intend to get the job done, and they care about the organization, and they care about success. And so people who engage in bullying, abrasive leaders, are often very high performers. And that's because they want to be seen as competent, but also because they care very much about success. And so again, when someone or something threatens that competence, combine that with somebody threatening the organization's success, then they lash out with bullying. So contrast that with an adequate leader, not even a good leader, just an adequate leader. An adequate leader sees a problem, explores the causes of the problem by talking with the individual about what's going on, and then addresses the problem by providing resources or, talking about training, and then ultimately setting limits, saying things like, if this doesn't improve, then we'll have to go down a new path. But that all comes after collaboration, right? What abrasive leaders are doing instead is seeing a problem, diagnosing incompetence. They go straight to that, and then they attack that incompetence by domination. So they see the problem, immediately go, well, that person's incompetent, and then they attack that. I see a few questions, so let me grab them. What if the bully says, they do what you want, they fear you, why don't they fear me? So the bully is asking, why don't they fear me? The bully wants their employees to fear them. Is that what I'm hearing? I'll need you to add to that, Janet, for me. Okay, another question here. Is it safe to say that bullies are insecure and being a bully is a defense mechanism? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. People who engage in workplace bullying are doing it from a place of feeling like they have to appear as super competent. And so they, honestly, if you think about it, if you spent your whole life walking around wondering and worrying if people saw you as competent or not, that would be a scary place to live in. I wouldn't want to live in that place where I'm always worried that people will see me as incompetent. That you almost feel sorry for it. So yeah, they are insecure. They want to be seen as competent, and anybody that threatens that competence, they defend. Okay, I see another question. How do you address a peer that lashes out but whose supervisor isn't exposed directly and doesn't address it when being informed? I would recommend actually speaking to the supervisor with a list of behaviors that you've witnessed. So keeping documentation of that behavior, and then speaking to the supervisor about it with all the documentation. You could also try getting other people involved and get them to help you, file this complaint or talk with the supervisor about it. So I'm just curious, how are we all doing right now? Is this making sense? Is this resonating with you? How are you feeling? Okay, people are saying I'm making sense, so that's good. Someone says, I always thought bullies were evil. They are not. They are not. Oh, someone else says I'm spot on. That's good. I get the incompetence part. All right, awesome. Glad you're all with me. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, so here's more of this lens I wanted you to look at. So think about being out there in the wild. So you're out there hiking on these beautiful hills, and along comes a bear. We could say that bears and bullies are similar, right? Your abrasive leader might look like this bear sometimes. Okay, so let's talk about how bears and bullies or abrasive leaders have some things in common. So first up, bears and abrasive leaders just want to go about their business. They are focused in survival. They want to, an abrasive leader wants to appear competent. In their mind, that's survival, and they want to get the job done. Bears are just sort of focused on doing their bear thing, right? Bears and abrasive leaders believe dominance pays. So what's happened is these abrasive leaders have learned along the way that dominance works for them. It gets them what they need. It gets people to do what they want them to do. It seems to work. So they do it. And bears and abrasive leaders will defend against threats to their survival with aggression. So again, abrasive leaders are focused on appearing uber competent. That is a big part of how they function, and anybody that threatens that uber competence, they defend with aggression. So let's just look at this kind of another way through what we call the TAD dynamic. So if you see a bear, you feel threatened by the bear. Your heart is going to start pounding, and you're going to start sweating, and you're going to start wondering what to do, right? So your anxiety kicks in when you see the bear. And then you figure out how to defend, and your instinct kicks in when it comes to defense, and you engage in either fight or flight, right? So now we really are talking about instinctual reaction. So if you see a bear, you feel a threat, it causes you anxiety, and your brain starts trying to figure out, do I fight or flee? If you have a shotgun, you might fight the bear, depending on how close it is. Hopefully you're not going around shooting bears, but if you're, if it's running towards you, for example, and you have a gun, you might shoot at it. Or you might flee, you might try to run away. The thing is that the bear is doing the same thing. So the bear sees you as a threat as well, and also feels anxiety. And then the bear might flee, which is most likely, unless it feels like it's in danger, then it will certainly fight you. But so both you and the bear are going through this process, and we call this the TAD dynamic. TAD stands for threat, anxiety, defense. So again, this is happening at work. We're down to our instinctual, our instincts. So you see, if you're being bullied, you see this individual, this abrasive leader, it's a threat to you, it causes you anxiety, and then you fight or flee. So fighting includes things like talking to HR about it. Fighting includes maybe trying to band together with your coworkers and file a report. You do things to try to fight the situation. Or you may flee, and in the workplace, fleeing includes things like not speaking up in staff meetings, avoiding this abrasive leader altogether. I hear a lot when I do interviews, people will say, well, we have our own special process to deal with that person so that we don't have to deal with them. So employees are fleeing also. And then on the flip side, the abrasive leader goes through the same process. The abrasive leader sees a threat to their competence, it causes anxiety, and they fight, right? Very rarely do they flee, but they fight, they get aggressive. Okay, so I see another question. Would fighting a non-aggressive bear count as bullying? Yeah, so people who are engaging in bullying, they're not necessarily going after aggressive people. They're going after people who they perceive to affect their competence, their ability to appear competence. Okay, so back to this original question. The bully wants people to fear her. She's upset because another leader gets the work done through the same people, but that's because he's respected, not feared. Yeah, so I think what you're describing there is this individual believes that she should be managing with fear, And that's what she believes the right management style is. And what she sees is that this other manager who's getting respect is getting the work done. So it's a matter of poor management. Again, not intentional. She just has it wrong when she's thinking about how to manage. Is the next step for HR to deal with their abrasive VP to go to an outside entity? Well, that's another good question. I think the next step is to go above the abrasive VP and bring your documentation with you and bring a group of you so that there's a bunch of you all talking about it to the next level up. So the last thing I'll say on this TAD dynamic here is that the difference between humans and bears in the TAD dynamic is that people have the ability to work through their anxieties. So a bear can't work through its anxiety. A bear will fight or flee and then it will move on. People, we have to work together and we have to figure out ways to reduce our anxiety. So I'll just say that when I coach abrasive leaders, this very model that you're looking at is a big part of the coaching process. And so I have this same kind of a conversation with the abrasive leader about fight and flight, and it's a frame of reference for many of our conversations. So what's interesting about this whole thing on the TAD dynamic is that managers are also fleeing. So CEOs flee, managers flee, HR often flees. And what does that look like? Well, management says things like it's just a personality conflict. Or they say, well, he's just got some difficult employees. Or they say he doesn't do it that often, or why are people sensitive, which some of you have been saying. Or, well, they're going to retire soon anyway, so we'll just let it go until they retire. So what's happening here is the manager or the CEO, whoever it is that's saying these things, they also live in a state of anxiety. So this abrasive leader causes them anxiety as well. And they are fleeing. Everything goes back to fight and flight. They are fleeing, and they're doing that with these sort of rationalizations and procrastinations. Is micromanaging a sign of bullying? Indeed, it can be. Micromanaging can be bullying if it's a part of a lot of other behaviors. So we can't say an unequivocal yes. But if somebody, sometimes employees need to be micromanaged if they're not performing. But just micromanaging everyone, yes, I would say that's bullying. Okay, so why don't employers intervene, or why are they fleeing? Well, they are afraid, they're hopeless, and they're helpless. So they fear harm. So I know a lot of times CEOs fear that if they address the bullying behavior, the individual will leave. And again, abrasive leaders are often top performers. And so the CEO is kind of thinking, if we just leave it be, people will have to figure out ways to get over it. I don't care about the costs. This person will leave and that will, cost me more. I need them. So there's this, the fear that this person will leave. There's the fear that it could get worse. So I hear that a lot too. HR might be afraid to speak up and talk about the bullying behavior as well, because they're afraid of what might happen, the retaliation. So again, CEOs often perceive this person to be pretty valuable. Also, it might be difficult to step in if you've tried to step in before and they were, this individual blocked the accusation. So maybe if you're in HR and you're on this webinar to understand how to step in, it may be that you've talked to this person before and of course they denied that there was anything wrong with their behavior. I'm going to help you overcome that. And then ultimately, there's a huge belief out there in the world that these individuals can't change. What's interesting about that is while everybody's running around being afraid of this person and what might happen if their behavior is addressed, they, again, have no idea that their behavior is so bad. And these are the kinds of things that I hear when I coach, when I have that first meeting, when the employer has finally agreed to step in and get a coach on board. This is what they say to me. I didn't know. I didn't know. And they're embarrassed and hurt that nobody told them they had toilet paper on their shoe. But as I said before, people have been telling them about it. They just weren't getting through. And so here's another animal reference for you. People who are abrasive leaders are really and truly lacking empathy. They're lacking social and emotional intelligence. So just to give you an example, you know, if you have social and emotional intelligence and you make a snarky comment at your coworker, you probably will notice their facial expression will change and their body language might change. And you care about emotions, and so you'll care about that and you'll probably apologize. An abrasive leader does not believe in the importance of emotions, and they honestly don't see what most of us see. They don't see the facial expression change when they make the snarky comment. Again, they have come to learn that they have to fight to the death to appear competent, and that is what's driving their behavior. And they don't see or care about the emotions. Emotions are irrelevant to them. And so part of coaching is helping them realize how important emotions are in the workplace. Okay, so here's what you need to do if you're in HR or leadership position. You have 3 steps to follow, and I'm going to talk you through them. The first step is to make this individual see. The next step is to make them care. And the third step is to get them help. So let's talk through that. So first, before I do that, I want to say this. Bullying is a performance problem, period, end of story. And what boggles my mind is that people get terminated and put on performance improvement plans and disciplined all day long, all around the world for all kinds of things, all sorts of behaviors that disrupt the organization's functioning. But abrasive leaders have this weird hold on the performance process, and everyone's afraid to put them in any sort of performance improvement plan. It is a performance problem. And I get this question a lot when I speak to HR. Well, you know, harassment's illegal, bullying's not. What do I do? And the answer is the same thing you'd do if they were showing up late all the time or stealing. You'd, you know, address it. So it's a performance problem. Nothing more, nothing less. It's a performance problem. And so keep that in mind. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's the same situation as stealing or showing up late or not doing your work, delivering poor customer service, anything else, it's the same thing. So get the fear out of your mind. So this first step, making them see, I see an exactly and an amen. So thank you for that. All right. So the first step, make them see. So, you know, what's happening, unfortunately, out there in the world is that a lot of performance processes really focus on technical performance. You know, so you look at the job description, the accountant's supposed to be doing XYZ, and if they're not doing XYZ, then they're not performing, and we can write that up. But you got to look at the interpersonal conduct as well. So your performance process should be addressing both technical and interpersonal conduct. And the problem is that abrasive leaders are very technically good at their jobs. Again, they're top performers. So if you only focus on technical performance, then you're not addressing the other half of it. But you know, most performance evaluations have communication skills, teamwork on them, you know, these sorts of skills. And so that person obviously gets a low score in all of those skills. So I'm not sure how a workplace bully or abrasive leader is even getting past performance evaluations. Next up, detect and document the negative perceptions and then present the negative perceptions to abrasive leaders as evidence that their conduct is unacceptable. We've had a steady stream of complaints from coworkers about their experiences interacting with you. We don't see this with other managers. This is not acceptable and cannot continue. We need to have you turn this around. So this is an example of a script you might use. So you're not going to say this is what everyone said about you. People think you're a bully and an asshole. You're just going to say, I'm getting complaints. I'm hearing things from coworkers about how they're interacting with you, and it has to stop. We need you to turn it around. Now, the person's, of course, going to deny it. They're going to say, I don't act that way. That's their side, but that's not how it was. They might say, well, who said that? I want to know the details. How could you possibly know? You weren't there. And that's fine. They can say all of that. But then your response is, the fact is, I don't know what happened. You're right. I have no idea. I wasn't there. But I do know one fact. Several of your coworkers feel they are being treated disrespectfully, and this can't continue. So you don't get into the fact battles with them. You have one fact, and the fact is that many people have complained. I'll also say too, unfortunately, a lot of times employers come to me because this person's crossed a line and there's been a hostile work environment complaint. So in that scenario, it's, hey, you had this hostile work environment complaint. The investigation came back that you're not engaging in harassment, but your behavior is still considered hostile by the people around you, and it needs to stop. So then the next step is to make these people care enough to want to change. So you have to set limits. So HR and leaders, those of you that are on my webinar here, the way you interact with others has to change in these ways. That's what you say, and you give them specific information. You can no longer yell. You have to speak professionally. You can no longer, do X, Y, Z. Instead, you need to do X. And you can no longer do this. Instead, I need you to do this. The other important piece is that you have to set consequences. So what happens is initially this individual engages in coaching because of the extrinsic motivation. So I actually will not take on a coaching client unless the employer has given a consequence. The consequence can be any number of things. It can be a threat of demotion. It could be pulling some of their salary. It could be a transfer to somewhere else. It could be pulling away some of their main responsibilities. It could be withholding resources from them to kind of help them or make it so they can't be successful. So again, employers, before you can engage in coaching, you do have to have a consequence in place. I understand that can be difficult if the CEO isn't on board with addressing the behavior. But again, a lot of times what happens is this person's gotten a hostile work environment complaint. And in today's day and age, why in the world invite that? Put a stop to it. This person can change. So your third step to intervention is to offer help. Internal mentoring is one option. So if you can find somebody that this individual trusts and respects, who's willing to take time to teach them. So going back to that example of the woman who wants to be feared, that's her goal. Sounds like you could find her a mentor in the organization, and maybe even that other boss who is respectful, and that individual could teach her how to behave differently or coach her in her management skills. The other option is specialized coaching, which we call boss whispering. So I wanted to take some time to talk through that. Okay, so I have a couple of questions. I have a bullying employee who truly doesn't get that yelling or rudeness is a performance problem. Okay, so curious, what you've said to him when he's come back and said it's not a performance problem or doesn't understand it. I'm just curious if you're hopefully you're adding and typing. Curious what the answer was. We'll use this as a case study. All right, instead of waiting, I'm not seeing an answer here. Here's what I'd say. This person they're in denial, right? They're denying that this is an issue. Oh, she came in. Makes it tougher, but I discussed the pattern of behavior, and this person's a union employee. Okay, so this person's a union employee. I get that there are rules around union employees. You can't necessarily just put them on a performance improvement plan the way you can a non-union employee. However, yelling and rudeness goes against your core values, I'm sure. It goes against any ability to build teamwork, communication skills. So I think a first step is to look at your performance evaluations and figure out how you can tie his or her behavior into the performance evaluation. And then again, going back to not engaging, you're not engaging in an argument with this person. It doesn't matter if they believe it's a performance problem or not. Their behavior has to change, and that's a fact. That's the fact that you have to deal with. And just because they're a union employee, it doesn't mean they get to act however they want. That's not what unions are for. And I recognize there's a little more red tape, but this individual doesn't just get to do whatever they want because they're a union employee. If you need to work with the union reps on it, I would certainly talk about the fact that harassment and bullying are similar behaviors, that you fear this individual is crossing the line or could easily cross the line. I would talk about workplace violence, that yelling can be a form of workplace violence because all that has to happen is fear on the other side. So again, don't engage in battles with this person. So he doesn't think it's a performance problem. That's nice. It is a performance problem, and it has to change. And that's the one fact that you get moving forward. And then you use step 3, which is to offer help. So again, the conversation is, I'm hearing a lot about you yelling and other behaviors. I don't hear about these negative behaviors about other employees. It's just you I hear these things about, and people are affected by them. The fact is that behavior has to change, and if it doesn't change, there will be consequences. It violates our core values, it violates our workplace violence policy, it violates our harassment policy, and it has to change. And not to worry, I've gotten you some help to help you change, and either it's a mentor or a coach, but don't engage in the battles with him. Okay, someone else says there's a this abrasive leader needs a majority vote in order to be removed. That I can't help you with. I can't help you with the behaviors. Okay, all right. I'll send you guys the slides. I'm getting a lot of questions about the slides. I'll send them. You talk me into it. Okay. Is it necessary to set a plan of incentives, penalizations to, I lost that one because another comment came in. Hang on a second. Let me make my window bigger here so I can see. Okay, is it necessary to set a plan of incentives to enforce this type of behavior we want? Is it effective for people with this personality? Yes, it is. It absolutely is. So here's the thing. This person is lacking insight. This person believes that in order to appear competent, they have to act with bullying. And this person has no idea that the damage they're causing, right? So when you intervene at this point in the game, this individual, the only way you're going to get them on board to coach is to offer the consequence. That's the only way they're going to be motivated to participate. Without the consequence, there's no way that they'll participate. And again, I won't take a coaching client unless a consequence has been laid out, that there has to be change. Now, the thing is that, and we'll talk more about this with boss whispering, over the course of boss whispering through the process, the motivation goes from the extrinsic, I'll be fired motivation, to wanting to change because they realize the kind of damage that they're causing, and because they realize that they actually appear incompetent. So in this type of behavior, absolutely, you have to set a consequence, because it's the only way you can motivate them to change at this point, because there is no insight. The coaching process brings the insight and the motivation changes. But at this point, yes, it has to be a consequence. Okay, so the other thing is, don't send them to training. And I get that question a lot. I get people call and they say, we have a bully. Could you come and do a company-wide training on communication skills? The answer is no. I do not want to stand in front of a room of people who feel, and I'm the elephant in the room, right? Don't send them to training. They have no insight. They don't believe there's anything wrong with their behavior. Training does not help. So don't send them to training. It's a waste of everyone's time and money. Okay, let me see. I have another question, and then I'm going to move into boss whispering. I have a bullying complaint from an employee against her manager, which we investigated and addressed. The problem is that the investigation, we discovered that the employee complaining exhibits the same behaviors that they were complaining about. How do we address this without looking like we are retaliating? Ooh, I think step one is to get an attorney involved in that. When we start talking about retaliation, we're talking about legal stuff. So I think part of that question needs to be answered by an attorney. I'm not an attorney, and I'm not giving you legal advice here. I would say that you do have the right to address that person's behavior as well. I would imagine an attorney would tell you that you have to be sure you have documentation that this individual really is engaging in bullying as well. So retaliation's going to be, or it's going to look like retaliation more, if it sort of looks like it came out of thin air. But since you have your investigation, and getting someone coaching is not retaliation, and that's the other part of the answer. So let's just talk about this for a second. So at this point, when you've told this abrasive leader, you have to change, and we got you a resource, these individuals are happy about that. This is not a negative thing. They are honored that the organization is investing in them, because technically you could say, you're on your final warning and then you're out. But what you said is you have to change, and we've got a resource for you to help you. And so I find that these abrasive leaders are very interested in learning from me, and they're very interested in changing because of this consequence up front. But again, over time, they come to realize the damage that they've been causing, and they are interested in changing. So I think, Denise, if you were to say, we've discovered that you're engaging in bullying behavior, but we've got you a resource and we want you to go through the coaching process, that is not retaliation. That is, we want to keep you. We want you here, and we got you some specialized training. So that's ultimately my answer, and hopefully you agree with me. Okay, so let's move forward. I see some other questions, but I got to move forward here. So for those of you on the call thinking, how do I get my CEO on board with this? The same process applies to you. You have to make the leaders see, make the leaders care, and then you offer a resource or hope and help. So in HR, it's your job to ensure that everyone feels comfortable and safe. We have a law that requires all organizations to create a safe work environment. Abrasive leaders create an unsafe work environment. So there's a lot of reasons why this needs to be addressed. And right now, I think a real great message for you to be using is that there are so many complaints about harassment right now, and you don't want to end up on a Me Too campaign on social media because you didn't address bullying. The other thing is, help the leaders see that coaching the bullying is possible. The behavior can change, and all the coaching is doing is making this person more effective, because people will stop going around them, because people are interested in working with this individual once they're different. So it's nothing but good things comes out of coaching. Make them care by talking about the consequences. Again, if you don't intervene, we're going to end up on a Me Too campaign. I don't know about you, but I don't want that. So setting consequences or sharing what you foresee the consequences to be, and then offering hope. So then you say, I found a coach who absolutely can make a difference. So let's talk about coaching. It's called boss whispering. I'm going to take a sip of water. Dr. Laura Crawshaw is the creator of this process that I'm about to go through. I did not invent it. She created it in 2009, though she created it from 40 years of coaching abrasive leaders. Her mission with boss whispering is to reduce suffering in the workplace. And the method that I'm using her method, is that she's increasing empathy and insight, and that's what I'm doing when I'm working with my clients. And again, she has been coaching for about 40 years, and she's coached almost 500 abrasive leaders, she figures. So how does it all work? Let's talk through it. So the crux of boss whispering is that it answers these 3 questions. What are the negative perceptions? What's causing them? And what strategies can we develop and implement to eliminate these perceptions? And so these are the 3 questions I seek to answer in partnership with my client. So boss whispering is about action research, which means that I come into the situation knowing nothing. So in my first meeting with a client, I'll say, how are you doing? How are you feeling about coaching? And they'll usually say, I had no idea my behavior was that bad. And then I'll say, well, you know what? I only know about your behavior from the things the HR manager told me. And what I'd like for us to do is understand what the real perceptions of you are. Are you interested in understanding the perceptions on a deeper level? And they'll say, yes, I absolutely am interested because I've been told that, I'll be demoted if I don't change. So I'm absolutely curious to know what's going on. And then I say, all right, great. Well, let's get 8 to 10 people that I can interview. And who should I interview? You think about it and get back to me. So the individual, the coach, or the client, this abrasive leader, gives me the name of 8 to 10 people that I can talk to about their behavior. And, then they make an email introduction, and then I take it from there. And I have specific questions that I answer in those, or that I ask in those interviews. And what I get out of those interviews is feedback, of course. And so I've got a real example of feedback that I've received from coaching. And what I do is take all of the notes from my interviews and I put them into themes and remove any identifying information. So while they know who I interviewed, they don't know who said what exactly. And I get these themes, and the kinds of themes I see are things like intimidates, poor emotional control, they're aggressive. And so then I take that feedback and I give it to the abrasive leader. So this abrasive leader, whose feedback this is, we read through this feedback bullet point by bullet point. And in this meeting, they are often feeling defensive, of course, but also hurt. People say things that are hurtful to them. They'll say things like, gosh, I didn't know people felt that way. So they're hurt. And what happens in this meeting is the intrinsic motivation starts to kick on. So this individual who's originally engaged in coaching because of the consequence is now engaged in coaching because they can see how much damage they've caused. And they can also recognize that they're not seen as competent. So they realize that people experience them as very incompetent when it comes to relationships, and that's hurtful to their ego. So then once we get through understanding those negative perceptions, we go into answering the next 2 questions. And so I spend the next 3 or 4 months working with the client to understand what's causing these perceptions. Why did people say you're too aggressive? And how can we eliminate that perception of you? And we go through it theme by theme. So here's what happens. During a conversation, this abrasive leader might say, well, I don't get it. No one ever speaks up in meetings. I don't understand. And then I'll say, okay, why do you think so? Why do you think they're not speaking up? And they'll say, well, I think they're probably lazy or stupid. And a lot of times I actually hear, well, I don't know, you're the expert. You tell me, what do you think? And I'll say, well, I don't know. I don't work there. You got to tell me. And so they don't understand. Why is nobody speaking up in meetings? And then we go through this model. So then I'll say, well, is not speaking up an example of fight or flight? And they'll say, well, I guess it's flight. They're not speaking up. And then I say, okay, well, that's a defense mechanism. So what are they anxious about? And how can we help them work through that anxiousness? And what we see is they've gained insight. They have these original theories, and then they say, they're afraid of me. Let's see, the feedback said I was too aggressive. That probably causes anxiousness, and so they're probably not speaking up because they're anxious about my being aggressive or that I'll criticize them. So that's the process. That's how these conversations unfold. So I have another question. Do I give the names of peers and coworkers? how do I get those names? Okay, so what happens is in my initial meeting with the client, I ask them to give me names. And it's not tell me who's going to give you negative feedback. I just say, I'd like to understand the perceptions of you. And they say, yes, I would like to understand the perceptions too. And then I say, okay, well, give me the names of the people I should interview. And they usually give me the names of all of the people they think will give them good feedback because they want to appear competent. And I think that's part of it. When they get the feedback, they realize even their own peers who they thought would give them good feedback said these things about them. But again, the feedback, I've removed all of the negative stuff. And there are certain questions that are asked in those interviews that helps me elicit the feedback. But then I remove all of the information and give them the themes. So hopefully that answers your questions. Okay, so what we're doing here is the insight cycle. So throughout the process of coaching, I'm getting this client to observe the behavior going on around them, to analyze that behavior through that TAD dynamic, asking them, every time they tell me about a behavior, I say, well, is that fight or flight? And then what's causing them anxiety and how can you reduce it? And then they go off and test it. And what happens is initially I had these feedback themes, and after about 3 to 4 months, I have these other themes. It's amazing. I love doing it. It is so awesome to hear in these second round of interviews what people say. People say things like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I don't know what you're doing, but my life is better. And they really have changed. These people really and truly can change. So just to give you an example of this is very real feedback from one of my other clients. You can see the themes there: providing autonomy, contributing, more collaborative. He's not lashing out at people anymore. So what happens is these people say in the end, I feel like it's okay to be human. Or they say, I feel like I've grown so much. My daughter says I'm much more in control of my emotions. So they come to improve their behavior and realize that bullying people was not working and was actually working against them.